I think I'll actually skip through to the starting point. Around the world, there's now a global commitment. Now, this started under the Howard government over a decade ago on an international convention on the ocean. Traditionally, our oceans have been open slather. People have done what they like, unlike on the land where we've got a whole range of rules and restrictions. On the land, the oceans have been open slather. But as time goes on, we realise that human species are having a large impact on the oceans, and that a lot of species in the ocean are in decline. And because of that, there's a global commitment to put 10% of every jurisdiction around the world under a sanctuary protection. So just put 10% of the ocean aside, just for the plants and animals that live there, to feed and breed and gather in an undisturbed manner. So that's the aim, that's the driving behind this. And that's happening around the world at different paces. Not every country is at the same place as Australia. And it's happening around Australia with different states at different levels. And it's happening in our Commonwealth waters as well as our state waters. And so that commitment has been made at an international level, and it's led to a state commitment as well, and the writing of the state legislation to make the marine parks. These are some of the Commonwealth parks. You can see around Australia. Off Queensland's got a large Commonwealth park. There's some off Tasmania. There's some in Australia, Great Australian Bight and off the Coorong. They're the ones that are normally 3 nautical miles or more off the coast, so that's the deeper water. What we're talking about at the moment is the state parks, which happen inshore or in the Gulfs, because the state waters run around the back of Kangaroo Island, making all the investigators state waters. It's a preventative approach. This is an approach that's been adopted by the government as seen as responsible stewardship of the ocean. In the hope that if we do put 10% of each type of habitat across the state aside, we are doing an insurance policy for the future in regards to the ocean's functioning. And so around the world, 10% is considered a good place to start. Some countries are higher, some are lower, but that is what the current science recommends. If you can get about 10% coverage, you are safeguarding your marine resource. And this, a lot of people say, why don't fisheries management? We've got bag limits, size limits, quotas. We've had a lot of changes over the last few years in fisheries management. You know, years ago, recreational people used to be able to own a net licence, or used to be able to go long lining. And as we learn more about stocks and the impacts that humans are having on that, these things have all been restricted, and I think most people would agree, for the better. The quotas have come in, gear restrictions have come in, and now our oceans are still in good shape, and some people even say that due to some recent fishery changes, there's some bigger fish and better fish being caught, particularly in these waters. But this program is about biodiversity. Every plant and animal, it's a safeguard. It's not just about the fish we catch and eat. Another concern that's often raised is that marine parks will be the death of recreational fishing. And we've done some studies around Australia, and we can't find any evidence of declines in fishing or local communities or towns subsequent to marine park introductions. So in these years, Tasmania, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria all introduced a range of sanctuary zones, and their boat registrations kept on sailing up. And if you actually dig into the data, things like global financial crises and fuel prices actually affects boating more. And places like Ningaloo, the year after they implemented the marine park, their fisher numbers doubled because people got to hear about it and they came along to fish in the marine park. And as I said here, visitor stays, there have been some dips. Like in 2006, there was a big dip when the fuel price soared and the global financial crisis. But when the marine parks were implemented themselves, there was no noticeable change. And now, the other idea that putting a small part aside of the ocean for conservation has a greater benefit for the rest of the ocean, that's been shown time and time again in hundreds of research papers, is that if you can put a small part aside but you don't disturb areas around that, it will not only make that area way more productive, it'll also help areas surrounding that. And subsequently, people fish right along the edge of marine parks. and sanctuary zones. So, like if you go down to Gleeson's at the moment, you'll see a row of cray pots marking the edge of the Gleeson sanctuary zone, because people know juvenile crays spend their time there, then migrate out. And so that's the context. So where we're at now is where we've put out some preliminary sanctuary zones, which on your maps, if they're in colour, are marked in green. In this map, it's marked in gold. And those are the zones where there's no taking of marine life. You can drive a boat through these zones. You can go diving, swimming, snorkeling in them, sail across them, but you can't be actively fishing while you're in those zones. You can have fishing gear on the boat, but it needs to be stowed. And so that's the sanctuary zones. That's what the talk is about at the moment, where they go. And there's a habitat protection zone, which is a lesser level of protection, but that won't affect recreational fishing. It just will stop activities like trawling or dredging, anything that rips up the seabed. So that won't be allowed. And that's what we expect most of the park will be zoned, that level of zoning. And there's a restricted access zone, which is shown in red on this map, which will only be used for scientific monitoring purposes, where you would ask the public not to go to that area. It might be around 100 metres around a sea lion colony. I think we've already got some restrictions around Goose Island out here. Okay, there's pretty much scientific consensus that there are threats to the marine environment. They can be summarised as climate change, resource use, the removal of fish from the ocean, and land-based impacts, invasive species and marine pollution. So essentially pollution, climate change and extraction are impacting. And those threats are hoped to be addressed by the Marine Parks Act. Because the Marine Parks Act deals with land-based pollution and runoff by tying into other acts, coastal development acts and environmental protection acts and a whole lot of other acts to try and reduce some of those threats. It also has in it sanctuary zoning criteria. Now the purpose of a sanctuary zone is to allow a food chain to function in a natural way. So this is just one food web. In the Southern Ocean we have 7,500 plants and animals, and most of them aren't fully understood. Even something as popular as King George whiting, there's still conjecture on where they spawn. You know, you hear different people tell different things, some reports have shown it, but it's very hard to understand some of these species because we can't study them like we can on animals on the land. But we do know that a lot of the fish species are now down to 20% or less of what their virgin biomass would be, what they'd be if it wasn't fished. So instead of having something like 100 fish in one area, you might have 20 or less. And that makes a change, because we're not actually taking out all the animals out of the food chain, we're just taking the ones that taste nice. And so just looking at this diagram, for example, let's say you take out lots of snapper, does that mean the crabs don't have predators anymore? Yep, maybe the crab numbers go up. Or if you take out lots of crabs, who's going to eat the starfish? You know, and there's just examples like that. And we don't know how all these effects happen. 7,500 different effects crossing over. And that's the idea of putting some areas into a complete sanctuary zone where you let that natural balance restore itself, and that's shown to be very robust and resilient to outside influences. And it's also highly productive. And this is just an example of ecologies we've seen around the world when different ecologies have gone out of balance. We've seen things like jellyfish blooms, an unnatural occurrence because there's no predatory fish left to eat the juvenile jellyfish eggs. And so once they get that, ecosystems can flip and become very unproductive. And the other interesting threat is if you, and this is hard to document as well, but if most times when you're catching good fish, it's because the fish are closely aggregated together, and often they're aggregated together to breed. They come together to breed. But that's a great time to catch squid, because you can see them all through the seagrass. You can pull up your bag limit quite quickly. But did they finish their breeding cycle and put enough eggs back out there? You know, whereas in a sanctuary zone, we will know that that will be happening. And the other point is, because it's very confusing to say that marine parks aren't necessarily about fisheries management, because sanctuary zones stop people fishing, so there is a clear link. But the aim is, as we learn more and more about the marine environment, the significance of what's even on the shore feeding into the deeper water is coming clear. Like how many nutrients come out of mangroves each year. There's tons of them. They come in to start the food chains in the marine environment. How much comes out of a healthy sand dune? How much goes in there? How much comes out of a healthy seagrass bed? How much comes out of a healthy reef system? And all these chains of events that we're now learning are integral to the health of the marine environment. And so that's why we're looking at every species, not just the ones that we like to eat, to protect. So even yes, unusual species, right down to shrimps, snails, slugs, we want them functioning as normal. And this is some research that's been published around the world of studied sanctuary zones. And biomass, just the weight of all the plants and animals, on average, on I think 124 sanctuaries studied, went up by 446% in the sanctuary zone. And so that just shows when you get a system functioning back in balance, it becomes highly productive. And there's also other effects outside of the sanctuaries as well. This is just one of those examples of food chains. This has been played out in a lot of rock lobster habitat in the southern oceans. Inside a reserve, you find rock lobster numbers go up because they're not being removed, and then they start controlling things like spiny sea urchins. And so in the reserve you have more lobster, less sea urchins, and with less sea urchins you get more kelp. And so you get a higher percentage of cover of kelp, which then provides homes and shelter for hundreds of other animals that lay their eggs on it, hide in it, their juveniles grow up in it, and so forth. So you can see that's just one of the chains that could happen in a sanctuary zone to make that beneficial to the ocean's health. And also, time and time again, marine parks have been shown to hold bigger fish, bigger crayfish, bigger other fish, and bigger fish are better breeders. And you can just see the scale. A small snapper doesn't put out even a fraction of what a large snapper would put out. And the other thing, as this is again just a comfort for wreck fishers, is around the edges of sanctuary zones you catch record-breaking fish. And this is an example of the Merritt Island Reserve in America, where they did it around Cape Canaveral, an accidental reserve, and now all the record-breaking fish are caught just adjacent to that reserve. Anyway, now I'm going to get down to the park of interest. These are the different habitats. Okay. To produce these preliminary sanctuary zones that you've got now, a range of information has been gathered. Firstly, the outer boundaries were chosen based on areas of biological significance, and that outer boundary in this park is shown in the blue line around the map there. And then the habitats were looked at within the park. Different, it doesn't show up very well there, but different patches of seagrass, different depth classes, different exposure to wind, different sea temperatures, different current types. All of that means different animals are going to live in different spots. So for example, in this park, there's actually 3 main regions in this park, biologically. So there's the offshore island of Wardang Island, there's the inshore bay of Port Victoria, which has its own sheltered qualities, and then there's almost 2 more. There's the sheltered little cove behind Point Pearce and up to Chinaman's, and then there's the long stretch of coast from Balgowan North, which they have distinct qualities. And to make a good marine park, you have to try and capture the homes and the living places of all the plants and animals. So you have to capture all the habitat types in the state. And that's why the marine parks are spread from east to west across this state to try and capture all those types. And so this is some of the thinking that's gone into the zoning. We also used, this is the sandpit information. I don't know if people remember or had exposure to, filling in little hexagons as to where you fish. That was a program we ran last year, and it's still running. This was some of the data we got back. It was quite interesting because the Chinaman's World community sent in lots of submissions. So they ended up with the red spot there showing high fishing in Chinaman's World. From the map, we also got shown that the northeastern side of Wardang Island was a very popular fishing ground, and so that was a bit of data we used to say, well, let's try and move the sanctuary zones away from those areas, and we did that to some extent, as you'll see. But we do know that's not the whole story, and a lot of people said they didn't put their information in because they thought we were going to overlay their favourite grounds with sanctuaries. But
I've done
we worked with it. So there's the zones, which I think you've all seen. Just to also let you know, we have what's called a local advisory group set up to work with each park, and that's an advisory group that has a mixture of people from fishing interests, commercial and recreational, industry interests, general community, shack owners and so forth. We have a group of those people who meet. They've had 3 meetings so far, and they're going to provide advice to the government, and this mechanism here is another mechanism for providing advice back through that group to government about your recommendations. And just initially, these lines on the map were some of the initial feedback of perhaps a different way that you could zone this park. With moving some of the zones to try and find a similar habitat elsewhere and making some zones smaller. At the next meeting, which is going to happen in February, we're going to discuss these zones with more detail. We're hoping to consider 5 or 10 different maps and provide that advice back to government. The stronger that advice is, the easier it will be for government to listen. And that's all I'll say for now. Thank you.